The Duke of Thornwell was carrying tea trays and polishing boots in his fiancée's manor, and no one suspected a thing. Elias had traded his title for servant's clothing to spy on the woman he was contractually bound to marry, determined to discover if Lydia Marston was a heartless fortune hunter. But when he overheard her call their union a business arrangement, nothing more, it should have confirmed his worst fears. Instead, it shattered something he didn't know he still had. Because the woman who spoke those cold words to her friend was the same woman who later confessed her deepest wounds to a footman named Thomas, never knowing that the servant seeing her cry was the Duke she'd be forced to marry in a week. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. Lydia Marston's fingers gripped the ducal letter, the seal and unwelcome promise of security. Her outward appearance, with the crown and graceful bearing, masked a woman whose romantic hopes had withered. In her private chambers, she shared her bitter fears with her trusted confidante, Clara Voss, the woman in teal, about the passionless alliance she was entering. Lydia's impending marriage to the Duke of Thornwell was necessitated by her family's precarious financial standing, a fact that had turned her noble bloodline and beauty into a commodity. Having been wounded by a previous betrayal, she viewed the coming union as a purely pragmatic transaction. She dreaded marrying a man described as cold, distant, a stranger whose reputation painted him as severe. Yet, the threat of financial ruin hung over her family, making refusal impossible. This marriage was the only salvation. Miles away in the stately grandeur of his house, Elias Thornwell, the Duke, stared at Lydia's portrait with hard, assessing eyes. Like Lydia, he approached the marriage with reluctance, driven by duty, specifically the need for a stable heir to prevent his fortune and ancestral lands from falling into the hands of an irresponsible relative. The thought of marrying a woman who saw him merely as a financial solution left him hollow and wary. He was haunted by his past grief and isolation, which made him desperate to know the true character of his bride-to-be, beyond the polished social facade. Determined not to repeat past mistakes, Elias instructed his valet to prepare common servant's clothing. His plan was drastic. He would infiltrate the Marston estate as a footman named Thomas, to observe the household dynamics and his fiancée's character in unguarded moments. Unaware of the new, watchful servant lingering just beyond her doorway, Lydia, the princess-like fiancée, confessed her deepest fears and cynicism, speaking bitter words about marriage and duty that made the disguised Duke's jaw clench. Rowan Ellinger, the scholar in blue, remains a silent fixture in the Duke's periphery, an intellectual contrast to the emotional drama unfolding. The coarse wool of the footman's livery chafed against Elias's skin in a way silk never had. He stood in the narrow servants' corridor of Marston Manor, his shoulders pressed against cold stone, and wondered, not for the first time since arriving 3 days prior, if he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. His hands, accustomed to signing documents and holding reins of thoroughbred horses, now ached from polishing silver and carrying heavy trays. The calluses forming at the base of his fingers were foreign, uncomfortable reminders of the vast distance between his true station and his assumed identity. "Thomas!" The head butler's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "Lady Marston's tea service, the blue parlour, and do try not to dawdle this time." Elias. Thomas, he reminded himself severely, straightened and reached for the tray prepared on the sideboard. The porcelain rattled slightly as he lifted it, and he forced himself to steady his grip. A duke did not tremble. But then, a duke did not typically carry tea trays either, and the weight distribution was proving more challenging than he'd anticipated. The servants' stairs were narrow and poorly lit, forcing him to move carefully. Around him, the manor hummed with activity. Chambermaids hurried past with fresh linens, their eyes downcast. A young scullery boy struggled with a bucket of coal. In his own household, Elias had moved through these same spaces as a master, barely registering the small army of people who maintained his comfort. Now, invisible in his disguise, he saw the intricate machinery of domestic life from an entirely different vantage point. It was humbling, it was exhausting, and it was absolutely necessary. The memory of Lydia's words, overheard on his first evening, still burned in his chest like a brand. I don't need a husband, Clara. I need a foundation. It is a contract, my bloodline for his fortune, nothing more. The casual dismissal, the cool pragmatism, had struck him with unexpected force. He had told himself he wanted a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience that would secure his line, but hearing his future reduced to such stark terms had hollowed something inside him. He needed to know if that cynicism ran bone deep, or if there was something more beneath the surface, something real. The servant's door to the main house opened into a small alcove behind the grand staircase. Elias paused there, adjusting his grip on the tray, and took a steadying breath. The blue parlour was only a short walk down the corridor, but each step carried him deeper into this dangerous charade. If he were discovered, the scandal would be ruinous. The Duke of Thornwell, skulking about in servant's clothing, spying on his own fiancée. Society would feast on such a tale for years, but he had come too far to retreat now. The blue parlour doors stood partially open, and voices drifted into the hallway, one warm and animated, the other softer, more measured. Elias approached slowly, his footfalls deliberately quiet on the polished wood floor. Through the gap, he could see flashes of colour, the rich teal of a woman's dress, the pale yellow of another. "You must be more excited than this, Lydia," the first voice insisted. Clara Voss, he recognized from previous observations. The lady-in-waiting had proven herself a constant presence at Lydia's side, chattering with relentless cheer. "A duke, and not some doddering old man either. I've heard the Duke of Thornwell is quite handsome, in a severe sort of way." Elias's jaw tightened. He raised his hand to knock, announcing his presence as protocol demanded. "Handsome or not, it hardly matters." Lydia's voice was quiet, almost resigned. "I shall see his face at the altar and learn to live with it, whatever it may be. As he will learn to live with mine." The words were not cruel, but their detachment sent a chill through him. Elias knocked, perhaps more firmly than necessary, and pushed the door open with his shoulder. "Your tea, my ladies." Both women looked up. Clara Voss offered him a bright, dismissive smile, the kind aristocrats bestowed on useful furniture. But Lydia's gaze caught him differently. Her eyes, a deep intelligent hazel, seemed to actually see him for a moment, before the polite veil of nobility descended. "On the table by the window, please," she said softly. Elias moved into the room, hyper-aware of every detail. The parlour was elegantly appointed but showed signs of genteel decline. The curtains were fine but faded slightly at the edges. The furniture was exquisite, but bore the patina of age without the regular restoration wealth provided. Even in their attempts to maintain appearances, the Marstons' financial struggles showed through. He set the tray down carefully, arranging the cups as he'd observed the other servants doing. From this angle, he had an unobstructed view of Lydia, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. She was beautiful. He had known that from her portrait. But the painting had captured only the surface, the delicate features, the elegant posture, the graceful line of her neck. It had failed entirely to convey the profound sadness that clung to her like morning mist. She sat with perfect deportment, her hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasantly neutral. But her eyes held a distance, a remoteness that spoke of dreams carefully buried down. This was not the cold, calculating woman he had feared. This was someone wounded, someone who had learned to protect herself through detachment. The realization shifted something in his chest. "Will there be anything else, my lady?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral, his eyes appropriately downcast. "No, thank you, Thomas." She remembered his name. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless. Most servants were invisible to the nobility, but she had bothered to learn it, to use it. He filed the observation away and retreated, pulling the door closed behind him. In the corridor, he allowed himself a moment to simply breathe. The encounter had lasted perhaps 2 minutes, but it had upended his assumptions more thoroughly than hours of planning had prepared him for. He had expected to find either a mercenary fortune hunter or a vapid society belle. Instead, he had glimpsed something far more complicated, a woman who seemed as trapped by this arrangement as he felt. The following days fell into a rhythm of careful observation and mounting physical exhaustion. Elias had vastly underestimated the demands of a footman's life. He woke before dawn to help lay fires, spent hours polishing boots and silver until his shoulders ached, and collapsed into his narrow servants' quarters each night with muscles protesting in languages he'd never learned. His valet, the only person aware of his true identity, had smuggled in salve for his blistered hands, which Elias applied in shameful secrecy. But the discomfort was worth it for the access it provided. Moving invisibly through the household, he observed Lydia in unguarded moments that no formal courtship would have revealed. He saw her in the morning room reviewing household accounts with a precision that spoke of necessity rather than interest. Her brow furrowed as she made careful notations, stretching resources that were clearly insufficient. When the housekeeper came to report that the butcher was demanding payment, Lydia's composure never wavered, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her pen. He saw her with her younger sisters, patience infinite as she helped them with lessons their impoverished father could no longer afford a governess to teach. She praised their work warmly, encouraged their questions, and somehow made education feel like play rather than duty. He saw her walking the estate grounds in the early evening, when the light turned golden and the world seemed suspended between day and night. She moved through the gardens with a wistfulness that suggested she was memorizing them, preparing to leave them behind. Once he watched from a distance as she paused beside a rose bush, touching the petals with such gentle sorrow that he had to look away, and he saw her with Clara Voss and Rowan Ellinger, the unlikely trio that seemed to form her inner circle. Clara was exactly as she appeared, vivacious, optimistic, determinedly cheerful in the face of Lydia's melancholy. She chattered about fashion and gossip, clearly attempting to distract her friend from darker thoughts. Lydia tolerated it with affectionate patience, occasionally offering a small smile that never quite reached her eyes. Rowan Ellinger was more enigmatic. The young scholar appeared at the manor several times a week, ostensibly to tutor Lydia's younger brother, but lingering afterward for tea and conversation. Elias first encountered him in the library, a room that had clearly seen better days. Half the shelves stood empty, volumes sold, Elias suspected to pay debts, but Rowan moved among the remaining books with reverent familiarity. "Thomas, is it?" Rowan had addressed him one afternoon, looking up from a Greek text with mild curiosity. Unlike most of the household, the scholar's gaze held genuine interest rather than dismissal. "You're new to the staff?" "Yes, sir. Just recently hired." Elias kept his posture deferential, his accent carefully modulated to suggest education slightly above his presumed station, enough to be useful, not enough to be suspicious. Rowan studied him for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable. You have the look of a man unused to this work. Your hands are wrong. Elias's heart stuttered, but he kept his expression neutral. I was in a different sort of service before, sir. Private secretary to a gentleman. He passed recently. It wasn't entirely a lie. His own secretary had indeed passed the previous year, leaving a gap Elias still felt keenly. Ah, that explains the air of literacy about you. Rowan returned his attention to his book, apparently satisfied. My condolences on your loss. The exchange left Elias unsettled. Rowan Ellinger saw too much, noticed details others overlooked. He would need to be more careful around the scholar. Later that week, Elias observed the three of them together in the conservatory, Lydia, Clara, and Rowan, and finally began to understand the dynamics that bound them. He had been tasked with trimming candles in the adjacent morning room, a job that placed him near enough to hear their conversation through the conservatory's open door. Rowan sat apart from the women, absorbed in a book, but occasionally offering commentary. Clara occupied herself with embroidery, her needle flashing in the afternoon light, and Lydia simply sat, her hands idle, staring out at the overgrown gardens beyond the glass. You're doing it again, Clara said without looking up from her work. Doing what? Disappearing. You're sitting right here, but you've gone somewhere else entirely. Lydia's smile was faint, apologetic. Forgive me. My mind wanders these days. To Thornwell, I imagine. Clara's tone was gently teasing. To your future as a duchess. Hardly. The word came out more sharply than Lydia seemed to intend. She softened it with a breath. I try not to think of it at all, if I'm honest. A difficult task, given that the wedding is mere weeks away. This from Rowan, who still hadn't looked up from his book. One would think anticipation, pleasant or otherwise, would occupy your thoughts considerably. One would think, Lydia agreed quietly. But I find that if I allow myself to dwell on it, I become quite unable to function. So I practice the art of deliberate ignorance. From his position in the morning room, Elias's hands stilled on the candle he'd been trimming. The ache in her voice was palpable, and it struck him with unexpected force. This was not the cynicism he'd heard in her earlier words to Clara. This was survival. It may not be as dreadful as you fear, Clara offered, her optimism undimmed. The Duke might prove a pleasant surprise. Perhaps he's kind. Perhaps he'll value you for more than your bloodline. Lydia's laugh was soft and utterly without humor. Perhaps the moon is made of cream cheese, and we simply haven't looked closely enough. Cynicism doesn't suit you, dearest. No, I suppose it doesn't. But realism must, or I shall shatter entirely. Rowan closed his book with a soft thump, finally giving the conversation his full attention. His expression was thoughtful, tinged with something that might have been concern. You know, Lady Lydia, there are worse fates than marrying a man you don't love. Marrying a man you do love, for instance, when the circumstances are impossible. At least this way you protect your heart. No expectations means no disappointment. How very encouraging, Rowan, Clara said dryly. You should write greeting cards. But Lydia was nodding slowly. Yes, exactly. It is a form of protection, isn't it? If I expect nothing, I cannot be hurt. You also cannot be pleasantly surprised, Rowan countered. But then, perhaps surprise is overrated. The conversation drifted to other topics, but Elias barely heard them. He stood in the morning room, a half-trimmed candle in his hands, and felt the foundations of his plan crumbling beneath him. He had come here to discover if Lydia Marston was a heartless fortune hunter who would make his life a calculated misery. Instead, he had found a woman who had been hurt badly enough to armor herself in pragmatism, who saw their marriage as a necessary sacrifice rather than a prize to be won. She expected nothing from him. She wanted nothing from him except the security his wealth could provide her family. It should have been exactly what he wanted. A practical arrangement, no messy emotions, no expectations of affection he wasn't certain he could provide. They could live parallel lives of polite distance, and neither would be disappointed. So why did the prospect feel so utterly hollow? That evening, as he hauled hot water up the servants' stairs for the family's baths, a task that left his arms trembling and his pride in tatters, Elias forced himself to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had undertaken this disguise to protect himself from a mercenary bride. But Lydia Marston was not mercenary. She was wounded, as he was wounded. She had learned to survive by expecting nothing, as he had learned to survive by trusting no one. They were mirrors of each other, circling toward a marriage that would unite their resources while keeping their hearts locked safely away. It was exactly what duty demanded. It was precisely what wisdom counseled, and it felt somehow like a tragedy waiting to unfold. Later that night, alone in his sparse quarters, Elias sat on the edge of his narrow bed and stared at his roughened hands. The ducal signet ring was hidden in his belongings, wrapped in cloth to prevent discovery. He could feel its absence on his finger like a phantom limb. What was he doing here? What did he hope to find? He had his answer now. Lydia Marston would make a perfectly adequate duchess. She was intelligent, dutiful, capable of managing a household and presenting a proper face to society. She would not embarrass him or exploit him. She would demand nothing he was unwilling to give. She would be exactly the wife he had told himself he wanted. The revelation should have brought relief. Instead, it sat in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy. Because somewhere in the last few days of watching her move through her constrained life with quiet grace and carefully hidden sorrow, he had begun to wonder if perhaps he wanted something more after all. The thought was dangerous, foolish. He had no business wanting anything beyond the practical arrangement they had both agreed to. And yet, as sleep finally claimed him, his last conscious thought was of Lydia's eyes in the blue parlor, hazel and intelligent and profoundly, unbearably sad. He was supposed to be observing her character. Instead, he was beginning to fear he was losing his own carefully maintained distance, and he had no idea what to do about it. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the drawing room, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Elias carried the silver tray with studied care, his footsteps muffled by the Persian carpet that showed threadbare patches near the door. He had been summoned to bring refreshments to Lady Marston and her companion, a simple enough task that he had performed dozens of times in the past week. Yet something about the particular quiet of the house today, the way the servants had been dismissed from this wing, set his nerves on edge. The drawing-room door stood slightly ajar, and voices drifted through the gap. He recognized them immediately. Clara's bright, insistent tone, and Lydia's softer, more measured responses. Elias hesitated in the hallway, uncertain whether to announce himself or wait for a natural pause in their conversation. The decision was made for him when Clara's voice rose with barely contained excitement. "Oh, come now, Lydia. You must have some feelings about him. The Duke of Thornwell is to be your husband in less than a fortnight. Surely you've allowed yourself to imagine what he might be like, what your life together might hold." Elias froze, the tray suddenly heavy in his hands. He should knock. He should announce his presence immediately. But his feet had rooted themselves to the floor, and he found himself holding his breath, waiting. "I have imagined very little, I'm afraid." Lydia's voice was calm, almost clinical. "There seems little point in constructing fantasies that will only crumble against reality. But that's precisely why you should indulge them now, while you still can. Is he handsome? The portrait your father showed you, did it please you at all? A pause. Elias could picture Lydia's expression, that careful neutrality she wore like armor. The portrait was well executed. The Duke appears to be a man of appropriate age and bearing. Beyond that, I confess I paid it little attention. Lydia! Clara's exasperation was evident. How can you be so detached? This is your future, your marriage. Do you feel nothing at all? The silence stretched long enough that Elias almost convinced himself to knock, to interrupt before he heard something he couldn't unhear. But then Lydia spoke, and her words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he understood. I don't need a husband, Clara. Her voice was quiet but absolutely steady, each word precisely chosen. I need a foundation. The Duke of Thornwell represents stability, security for my family. This marriage is a contract, my bloodline for his fortune, nothing more. To pretend otherwise would be a cruelty to myself. Elias felt the words like a physical blow. His breath caught in his chest, and the tray trembled in his hands, porcelain rattling softly against silver. He steadied it quickly, desperately, but the damage was already done, not to the tea service, that remained intact, but something inside him had cracked, and he couldn't quite identify what it was or why it hurt so profoundly. This was what he had told himself he wanted, a practical arrangement, no expectations, no messy emotions, no risk of the vulnerability that had destroyed him when Catherine died. Lydia's words should have reassured him, confirmed that they were perfectly matched in their pragmatism. Instead, he felt hollow. That's a terribly cold way to view marriage, Clara said softly, and Elias heard genuine concern beneath her usual brightness. Even a practical marriage can grow into something more. Affection, companionship, perhaps even love? Lydia's laugh was brief and utterly devoid of humor. No, Clara, I learned that lesson already. Love is a luxury I cannot afford, and a risk I will not take. The Duke of Thornwell will receive a dutiful wife who will manage his household, bear his heirs if God wills it, and maintain the dignity of his name. In return, my family will be saved from ruin. It is a fair exchange, and I will not poison it with impossible hopes. But surely you deserve more than mere fairness. You deserve happiness, Lydia. You deserve to be cherished. Perhaps. But deserving and receiving are rarely the same thing, are they? I have made my peace with what this marriage is and what it is not. I suggest you do the same, dearest friend, or you will spend the wedding breakfast in tears while I remain perfectly composed. Elias forced himself to move, to lift his hand and knock firmly on the doorframe before pushing the door open with his shoulder. Both women looked up, their conversation cutting off abruptly. Clara's expression showed mild annoyance at the interruption, but Lydia's face, Lydia's beautiful, melancholy face, remained serenely neutral, as though she had been discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. "Your refreshments, my ladies," he said, proud that his voice emerged steady, despite the chaos in his chest. "On the side table, please, Thomas," Lydia instructed without quite meeting his eyes. He set the tray down with mechanical precision, arranging the cups and saucers, the small plate of biscuits, the sugar bowl and cream. His hands performed the tasks his training had ingrained while his mind reeled. She sat less than 6 feet from him, this woman who would become his wife, who viewed their union as nothing more than a business transaction. She had no idea that the servant carefully pouring her tea was the very man she had just reduced to a means of financial salvation. The irony was almost laughable. Here he stood, disguised as a footman to discover her true character, learning truths he wished desperately he could unhear. "Will there be anything else, my lady?" "No, thank you." That will be all. Dismissed. Elias bowed and retreated, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click. In the hallway, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, pressing his back against the cool wall and closing his eyes. His heart beat too fast, his throat felt tight, and he couldn't quite catch his breath. What had he expected? That she would confess secret affection for a man she'd never met? That she harbored romantic hopes about a stranger twice described to her as cold and distant? He had wanted to avoid a mercenary bride, and instead he'd found something worse. A woman who had given up on anything beyond the mercenary. A woman who had armored her heart so thoroughly that she could speak of her own marriage with the emotion one might afford a property transaction. They were both wounded, he realized. Both so determined to protect themselves from further pain that they were willing to settle for a life half-lived, a marriage that was legally binding but emotionally barren. The revelation should have brought some measure of comfort or solidarity. Instead, it filled him with a grief he couldn't quite name, because somewhere in the past week of watching Lydia move through her constrained life with quiet grace, he had begun to hope, foolishly, dangerously, that perhaps this marriage might become something more than duty. Her words had extinguished that fragile hope as efficiently as snuffing a candle. Elias pushed himself away from the wall and moved toward the servants' stairs, his body heavy with exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. He had his answer now. He knew exactly what Lydia Marston thought of their marriage, of him, of the future they would share. The question was, what was he going to do about it? It began with small things. A request for Thomas specifically to bring her morning correspondence. An instruction to the housekeeper that Thomas should attend to the library fire rather than one of the other footmen. Lydia's requests were made casually, without particular emphasis, but Elias noticed them nonetheless. After days of moving through the household as an invisible presence, being seen, even in his disguise, felt strange and unsettling. He told himself she had simply grown accustomed to his face, that familiarity bred preference. But sometimes when he entered a room at her summons, he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity, perhaps. Or puzzlement, as though she were trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. The library had become his refuge during the brief moments when his duties allowed respite. The Marston collection was a shadow of what it must once have been. Empty spaces on shelves marked where volumes had been sold. But what remained showed exquisite taste. He found comfort among the books, these silent companions that asked nothing of him but attention. It was there that Lydia found him on a grey afternoon when rain drummed against the windows and the rest of the household drowsed in post-luncheon torpor. Elias had been reshelving books, a task he'd volunteered for to escape the head butler's increasingly suspicious scrutiny of his inadequate bootblacking skills. He had just retrieved a slim volume from the reading desk when the door opened. There was no time to replace the book, no opportunity to assume a more appropriate posture. Lydia stood in the doorway, surprise evident on her face, and Elias realized with sinking dread that he still held the book open in his hands. Marcus Aurelius. Meditations, in the original Greek. Thomas. Her voice was quiet, questioning. She closed the door behind her and moved into the room with that distinctive grace he had come to recognize. I didn't realize anyone was here. He should lower his eyes, apologize for the presumption of touching her father's books. Instead, he found himself meeting her gaze, the volume still open in his hands like evidence of a crime. Forgive me, my lady. I was reshelving and became distracted. Lydia's eyes dropped to the book, and he watched comprehension dawn in her expression. Not anger, as he might have expected, but something closer to astonishment. You read Greek? It wasn't quite a question, but it demanded an answer nonetheless. Elias weighed his options in the space of a heartbeat. He could lie, claim he was merely admiring the binding. But something in her face, genuine interest, the first spark of real curiosity he'd seen breach her careful neutrality, made him choose a dangerous honesty. My previous employer believed in educating his staff. He was unconventional in that regard. Unconventional indeed. Lydia moved closer, and Elias caught the faint scent of lavender. To teach a servant classical languages suggests either remarkable generosity or remarkable eccentricity. Perhaps both, my lady. A smile ghosted across her lips, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. What passage has captured your attention so thoroughly that you've forgotten your duties? He glanced down at the page, though he knew the words already. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Book 8, Lydia said softly, and now it was Elias's turn to feel surprised. She saw his expression, and her smile returned, more substantial this time. My father taught me Greek before he taught me embroidery. My mother was horrified, but he insisted that a mind was a terrible thing to leave unfurnished, regardless of one's sex. Your father sounds like a wise man. Wise enough to know the value of education. Not quite wise enough to avoid a gambling habit that has reduced this library to a fraction of its former glory. The words were matter of fact, but Elias heard the old pain beneath them. The meditations survived only because they were my mother's, and he could not quite bring himself to sell them, even at our most desperate hour. Elias closed the book carefully, acutely aware that they had crossed some invisible boundary of propriety. A lady did not linger alone in a room with a footman, did not share family confidences with a servant. Yet Lydia made no move to leave, and he found himself unwilling to break whatever spell had momentarily suspended the rigid hierarchy between them. Marcus Aurelius understood something of duty and constraint, he said quietly. An emperor who would rather have been a philosopher, bound by obligation to a role he never sought. Lydia's eyes sharpened with interest. You see him as trapped, don't you? Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. That's the writing of a man who has learned to find freedom in the only place he has any control, his own thoughts. Or the writing of a man who has accepted that external circumstances cannot be changed, and so chooses to change his response to them. Lydia moved to the window, her fingers trailing along the spine of a book as she passed. I've always found comfort in that. The Stoics understood that we cannot control what fate brings us, only how we meet it. Is that how you've chosen to meet your own circumstances, my lady? With Stoic acceptance? The question was far too familiar, too direct. Elias realized his error the moment the words left his mouth. But Lydia didn't stiffen with offense. Instead, she turned from the window, and her expression held a vulnerability he had not seen before. I am trying, she said simply. Though I confess I find it easier to admire Stoic philosophy than to embody it. Marcus Aurelius did not have to marry a stranger to save his family from ruin. No, but he did have to sacrifice his personal desires for the good of an empire. Perhaps the scale differs, but the principle remains the same. And did his sacrifice make him happy, do you think? The question hung between them, weighted with meaning that had nothing to do with ancient emperors. Elias set the book down on the desk and chose his words carefully. I think happiness was not his aim. Virtue, duty, service, these were his lodestars. Happiness, if it came at all, was incidental. How very bleak. Or how very honest. Perhaps we do ourselves a disservice by expecting happiness as a natural consequence of doing what is right. Sometimes duty simply requires sacrifice, and no amount of philosophical reasoning makes the burden lighter. Lydia studied him with an intensity that made him acutely conscious of every aspect of his disguise. The rough fabric of his livery, the slight calluses on his hands, the careful modulation of his accent. For a terrifying moment, he was certain she could see through it all, that his true identity was written plainly across his face. "You are not like other servants," she said finally. "I hope I have not given offense, my lady." "No. No offense." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the latch. "Thomas, I wonder if you might assist me with a project. Some of my father's correspondence is in Latin, and I find myself struggling with certain passages. Would you be willing to lend your education to the task? I would, of course. Ensure it did not interfere with your other duties." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that spending time alone with her would only deepen the deception and complicate the inevitable revelation. But looking at her face, seeing genuine interest rather than the careful neutrality she wore like armor, he found himself incapable of refusing. "I would be honored to assist you, my lady. Tomorrow afternoon, then. 2:00, here in the library." She opened the door, then glanced back. "And Thomas, you need not apologize for reading. A mind that values philosophy is a rare gift, regardless of the station of its owner." She was gone before he could respond, leaving him alone in the library with the sound of rain and the profound realization that everything had shifted. The cynical woman who had spoken of marriage as a bloodless contract was the same woman who read Marcus Aurelius and valued a servant's mind. She was not one thing or the other, but both, wounded and thoughtful, pragmatic and searching. And he was falling into something he had no name for, something that terrified him far more than any physical labor his disguise demanded. The conservatory had seen better days. Glass panes, some cracked and poorly mended, formed a skeletal dome over what had once been an impressive collection of exotic plants. Now only the hardiest specimens remained. Ferns gone wild, a few struggling roses, ivy that had taken over entire sections with aggressive enthusiasm. It was beautiful in its neglect, a space the family could no longer afford to maintain, but couldn't quite bring themselves to abandon. Lydia stood among the greenery when Elias arrived, her yellow dress a spot of cultivated sunshine against the wild growth. She had asked for him specifically that morning, requesting his assistance with moving some of the heavier planters. The head butler had grumbled about footmen being used for gardening work, but Lydia's quiet insistence had won out. "Thank you for coming, Thomas." She gestured toward several large ceramic pots clustered near the far wall. "I want to bring these closer to the light. They're struggling where they are, but I haven't the strength to move them myself." It was honest work, and Elias found himself grateful for it. The planters were indeed heavy, filled with soil gone dense and root-bound. He moved them carefully, following Lydia's instructions, acutely aware that they were quite alone here. The conservatory sat at the far end of the manor's grounds, separated from the main house by a stretch of overgrown garden. No one would interrupt them. No one would think to look for either of them in this forgotten place. "Here, I think," Lydia said, indicating a spot where afternoon light pooled on the flagstones. "They're camellias. My mother planted them when she first married. She said they reminded her of home." Elias settled the final pot into place and straightened, brushing soil from his hands. "They should do better here." "Yes." Lydia touched one of the glossy leaves with careful fingers. "I find myself wanting to tend them properly before I leave. It seems important, somehow, to ensure something survives." The melancholy in her voice drew his attention from the plants to her face. She wasn't looking at him, but rather at the camellia, her expression distant and unbearably sad. "My lady, do you know why I asked you here, Thomas? Truly?" She finally met his eyes, and he was struck by the raw honesty in her gaze. "It wasn't just for the planters. I could have requested any of the footmen for that. I asked for you because you're the only person in this house who doesn't treat me like fragile porcelain that might shatter at an indelicate word." Elias felt his throat tighten. "I would never presume, but you do presume. You speak to me as though I'm capable of understanding philosophy, of having thoughts beyond needlework and social calls. Do you know how rare that is?" She laughed softly without humor. "Clara means well, but she wants to protect me from every sharp edge. My parents tiptoe around me as though I'm an invalid, even Rowan, for all his intellectual conversation, keeps a careful distance. But you argue with me about Marcus Aurelius. You challenge my interpretations. You see me as a mind rather than merely a duty. You are far more than a duty, my lady." "Am I?" She turned away, moving deeper into the conservatory's green shadows. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm anything at all, or simply a collection of obligations wearing a pretty dress." Elias followed her, drawn by the pain in her voice. "What happened to make you believe that?" For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. The silence stretched, filled only with the sound of water dripping from leaves and the distant call of birds. When Lydia finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "I was in love once. Truly. Foolishly in love. Lord James Hartley." She spoke the name like a confession. "He courted me for 6 months. Said everything a young woman dreams of hearing. I believed him. I believed that love was enough, that our affection would overcome any obstacle." Her fingers trailed along a vine, following its twisted path. "Then my father's debts became public knowledge, and suddenly Lord Hartley remembered a pressing obligation in Scotland. I received a letter, very polite, very apologetic, but the message was clear. Love, it seemed, had limits, and those limits were defined by my family's declining fortune. He was a fool. Was he? Or was he simply honest about what I refused to see? That in our world marriage is a transaction. Love is a pleasant fiction we tell ourselves to make the bargaining more palatable." She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. "He taught me a valuable lesson, Thomas. Hope is a luxury I cannot afford. Better to accept the truth of what this marriage to the Duke is, a necessary exchange, than to poison it with impossible expectations." Elias felt her words like a blade between his ribs. This was the source of her cynicism, the wound that had taught her to armor her heart, and he, disguised and deceiving, was in no position to offer comfort without adding to her betrayal. "Not all men are Lord Hartley," he said quietly. "Perhaps not. But how does one tell the difference? How do you trust when trust has been weaponized against you?" The question hung in the air between them, and Elias recognized his own reflection in it. How many times had he asked himself the same thing after Catherine's death? How many times had he chosen isolation over the risk of connection? "You don't," he heard himself say. "You learn to live without it. Trust becomes a luxury you can't afford, like hope. You build walls high enough that no one can scale them, and you tell yourself it's wisdom rather than cowardice." Lydia's eyes widened slightly. "You speak as though you know." "Because I do." The admission came easier than it should have, here in this forgotten place with this woman who saw too much. "I loved someone once. She died, and took something of me with her. I thought if I could just control enough variables, protect myself sufficiently, I would never hurt like that again. So I chose duty over connection, obligation over vulnerability. I told myself it was the rational choice. And was it? Rational. Yes. Wise? He met her gaze. I'm beginning to think wisdom and isolation are not the same thing, no matter how often I've conflated them. Lydia moved closer, and in the dappled light filtering through the conservatory's dirty glass, she looked ethereal and heartbreakingly real all at once. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Two people so afraid of being hurt again that we've chosen numbness instead. Is that what you've chosen, truly? I thought I had. I thought I'd made peace with a marriage of convenience, with a life of pleasant detachment. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. But then you appeared with your Greek philosophy and your understanding eyes, and I find myself wondering if perhaps I was wrong, if perhaps some risks are worth taking after all. The moment stretched between them, fragile and dangerous. Elias knew he should step back, should remember his place, both his assumed station and his true identity. But he was caught in her gaze, trapped by the terrible realization that this connection they'd forged was built on a foundation of lies. "My lady," he began, but she shook her head. "Here, in this place, could we simply be Lydia and Thomas? Not lady and servant, not obligation and duty. Just two people who understand what it means to protect a wounded heart." It was the cruelest kindness she could have offered. Because he wasn't Thomas. He was Elias Thornwell, the very Duke she would marry, the man she expected to be cold and distant. And every moment he spent in this intimacy was another thread in a web of deception that would eventually ensnare them both. But looking at her face, seeing the tentative hope breaking through her careful cynicism, he found he couldn't refuse her. "Just Lydia and Thomas," he agreed softly, and watched something in her expression ease, a tension he hadn't realized she carried finally releasing. They stood together in the green shadows, two wounded souls finding unexpected respite in each other's company, neither knowing that the foundation they were building would soon be tested beyond bearing. The storm arrived just after nightfall, rolling across the countryside with the kind of violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, and wind howled through gaps in the old house's defences, making the curtains shudder and candle flames dance wildly. The servants moved through their evening duties with hunched shoulders and hurried steps, eager to finish and retreat to their quarters. Elias had been dismissed for the night and should have been grateful for the respite. His body ached from the day's labor, and the narrow bed in his quarters promised at least a few hours of uncomfortable rest. But something drew him back through the darkened corridors, a nameless unease that wouldn't let him settle. He found Lydia in the music room, a space he'd learned she rarely used. She stood at the window, her forehead pressed against the glass, watching the storm with an intensity that suggested she wasn't seeing the weather at all. Even from the doorway, he could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched at her sides. The single candle she'd brought cast her shadow long and distorted across the floor. She hadn't heard him approach over the sound of the storm. He should leave, should respect her privacy in this moment of obvious distress. Instead, he found himself retreating to the kitchens, preparing a tea tray with hands that had finally learned the proper rhythm of domestic tasks. When he returned, she still stood at the window, motionless as a statue. "My lady." His voice was soft, but she startled anyway, turning with wide eyes that glistened in the candlelight. "I thought you might want tea on a night like this." For a moment he thought she might dismiss him, send him away with the cool politeness she showed the other servants. But then her composure cracked, just slightly, and he saw the naked anguish beneath. Thomas. His false name on her lips felt like an accusation. You shouldn't be here. It's not proper. Propriety seems a small concern on a night when the world is trying to tear itself apart. He set the tray down on the pianoforte and poured, the familiar motions giving his hands something to do. What's troubling you? Everything. Nothing. She accepted the cup he offered, wrapping her hands around it as though seeking warmth. The wedding is in 5 days. 5 days, and I will belong to a man I've never met, in a life I've never wanted, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything I might desire for myself. Thunder cracked overhead, and she flinched. Elias moved closer, drawn by her pain despite every warning his rational mind screamed. You're frightened. I'm terrified. The admission seemed torn from her. Not of him precisely. I'm sure the Duke is perfectly adequate, but of what it means. Of spending the rest of my life as a transaction, a bloodline for a fortune, a womb for an heir. I keep thinking about those camellias in the conservatory, beautiful things potted and placed where someone else decides they should grow, whether it suits them or not. You're not a plant, Lydia. Aren't I? I have as much agency as one. My roots are being torn up and transplanted to serve someone else's garden. She set down the teacup with shaking hands. Do you know what the worst part is? I agreed to this. I could have refused, could have let my family face ruin. But I didn't, because duty and obligation are what I was raised to value above all else. So I'm complicit in my own sale. The words cut through Elias with devastating precision. This was what his pragmatic arrangement looked like from her perspective, not a mutual agreement between equals, but a forced surrender of self. He had thought himself generous, offering to save her family from ruin, but he had never considered what it cost her to accept. You're not being sold, he said, though the conviction in his voice was faltering. You're making a sacrifice for people you love. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? I'm trading my body, my future, my autonomy for money. What else would you call it? He had no answer. The silence stretched between them, filled with the storm's fury and the weight of truths neither wanted to speak. I lost someone, Elias heard himself say, the words emerging from some deep place he'd kept locked. My wife. 5 years ago. She died in childbirth. And our son with her. Lydia's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the rain. Thomas, I thought I would die too, from the grief of it. She was everything good in my life, everything light and warm. When she was gone, the world went cold and has never quite warmed again. His hands clenched at his sides. I became someone I didn't recognize. Someone who trusted nothing, felt nothing, wanted nothing except to never hurt like that again. I built walls so high that no one could reach me, and I told myself it was strength, self-protection. But it was isolation, Lydia said softly. Yes, complete and absolute isolation. I chose duty over connection because duty was safe. Duty couldn't betray me or leave me shattered. He met her eyes, and in the candlelight, he let her see the truth of his pain. I convinced myself that a marriage of convenience was wisdom, that choosing someone I couldn't love deeply meant I couldn't lose deeply. I thought I was being rational. And now? Now I think I was being a coward. I thought isolation would protect me from pain, but it's only given me a different kind of suffering. A slow, cold emptiness instead of sharp, hot grief. I'm not certain which is worse. Lydia moved toward him, closing the distance between them with steps that felt weighted with significance. We're both cowards, then, both so afraid of being hurt that we've chosen half-lives instead of whole ones. At least you have the excuse of youth. You might still learn to hope again. And you think yourself too old for hope, too wounded. I think I've forgotten how, and I think—" He stopped, the confession catching in his throat, but her eyes held such understanding, such gentle encouragement that he couldn't hold it back. "I think I'm beginning to realize what I've lost by choosing safety over risk. What I'm still losing. Every day I remain locked behind these walls I've built." Lightning illuminated the room in a brief, stark flash, and in that moment, Lydia reached out and took his hand. The touch was electric, inappropriate, entirely improper, and utterly necessary. "Thomas, I need to tell you something." Her voice trembled. "These past weeks, speaking with you, being seen by you, you've made me feel like a person again instead of a commodity. You've reminded me that I have thoughts worth sharing, that my mind and heart matter beyond what they can provide to others. I was drowning in duty and obligation, and you've been air." Elias felt something crack open in his chest, some sealed chamber he'd kept locked since Catherine's death. "Lydia, I know we can't. I know this is impossible. You're a servant. I'm promised to another man, and in 5 days I'll be gone from here. But I needed you to know that you've mattered, that you've changed something in me I thought was dead forever." The cruelty of the moment was exquisite. She was offering him her heart, fragile, tentative, beginning to hope again, and he was accepting it under false pretenses. He was the Duke she would marry, the cold stranger she dreaded. And when she learned the truth, this moment, this connection, would transform from something precious into evidence of his betrayal. He should tell her. He should reveal himself now, here, before the deception grew any deeper. But looking at her face, seeing something like joy breaking through her careful defenses, he found himself paralyzed. "You've mattered to me too," he said instead, and it was the truest thing he'd spoken in weeks. "More than I can explain, more than is wise." The storm raged outside, and inside 2 wounded souls reached for each other across an abyss neither fully understood, building something beautiful and doomed on a foundation of half-truths and hidden identities. The messenger arrived during breakfast, his horse lathered from hard riding. The household stirred into immediate chaos, maids rushing to prepare guest chambers, the housekeeper issuing sharp orders, the cook lamenting the state of the larders. Elias heard the news from the head butler, who seemed personally affronted by the short notice. "The Duke of Thornwell will arrive day after tomorrow, as if we're some common inn that requires no preparation." The man's mustache quivered with indignation. "He sends word he wishes to meet his bride before the wedding, to discuss arrangements. The presumption of it, as if Lady Lydia has nothing better to do than wait upon his convenience." Elias kept his eyes downcast, his expression neutral, while panic clawed at his chest. 2 days. He had 2 days before his carefully constructed deception collapsed under the weight of reality. 2 days before Lydia met the Duke of Thornwell and realized that the servant she'd confided in, the man she'd begun to trust, was the very person she'd been dreading. He couldn't let her discover it that way. He couldn't let her stand in the drawing room and watch him walk through the door in ducal finery, couldn't bear to see the realization dawn on her face in front of witnesses. She deserved better than that. She deserved the truth, however devastating, delivered in private. That evening, he wrote the note 3 times before he was satisfied. His hand shook as he formed the words, his usual elegant script deliberately roughened to match Thomas's station. "My lady, I must speak with you urgently on a matter that cannot wait. Please meet me in the library at dawn, before the household wakes. What I have to tell you will change everything. I pray you will grant me this audience. T. He left it in the library, tucked into the meditations where he knew she would find it during her evening reading. Then he retreated to his quarters and did not sleep, watching the hours crawl toward morning with dread sitting heavy in his stomach. Dawn came grey and hesitant, the sun struggling through clouds that promised rain. Elias dressed carefully in his servant's livery for the last time, then slipped the ducal signet ring from its hiding place in his belongings. The weight of it in his pocket felt like a condemnation. Lydia was already in the library when he arrived, standing by the window in a simple morning dress, her hair not yet properly arranged. She turned as he entered, and the soft concern in her expression nearly broke him. "Thomas, what's wrong? Your note sounded so urgent." He closed the door behind him, and she didn't protest the impropriety. They had moved beyond such concerns in the conservatory, during the storm. She trusted him now. The knowledge was a knife between his ribs. "Thank you for coming." His voice emerged rougher than intended. "What I have to tell you. There's no way to make this easy. No words that will soften it." Worry creased her brow. "You're frightening me." "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the ring, holding it in his palm, where the early light caught the gold and made the ducal crest unmistakable. "I need to show you something." Lydia's eyes dropped to the ring. For a long moment she simply stared at it, her expression uncomprehending. Then he watched the pieces fall into place, the significance of the crest, the implications of a servant possessing such an item, the terrible logic of it all. "Where did you get that?" Her voice was very quiet, very controlled. "It's mine." He met her eyes, let her see the truth in his face. "I am not Thomas Wells. I have never been Thomas Wells. My name is Elias Thornwell, and I am the Duke you are to marry in 3 days' time." The color drained from her face. She took a step backward, then another, as though proximity to him was suddenly unbearable. "No. Lydia. No. This is some kind of mistake. Some jest. You're—" She looked at him, really looked, and he watched her catalogue the details she'd overlooked. The way he held himself, the education he should never have possessed, the hands that had been too soft when he'd first arrived. Oh God, it's true. I can explain. You lied to me." The words emerged flat, emotionless. Shock, he realized. She was in shock. Everything was a lie. Not everything. The conversations we had, the things I told you, those were true. My grief, my isolation, Your grief, your isolation? Her voice rose, sharp and brittle. You stood in that music room and told me about your dead wife while lying about your very identity. You listened to me confess my deepest fears about marrying a cold, distant duke, never thinking to mention that you were that duke. I wanted to know the truth of you. Before we married, I needed to understand. Understand what? The shock was burning away, replaced by something white-hot and devastating. Whether I was mercenary enough to deserve your suspicion, whether I passed your little test. She laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. And what were your findings, Your Grace? Did I prove myself adequately genuine? Sufficiently worthy of your noble hand? It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Explain to me how this was anything other than a calculated, cruel exercise in manipulation. You infiltrated my home, posed as a servant, listened to my private conversations, Let me bare my heart to you, all while lying with every breath. How is that not the act of the exact cold, unfeeling man I was terrified of marrying? Elias felt her words like blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. I was trying to protect myself. After Catherine, I couldn't. I needed to know if I was mercenary, fortune hunting. Her eyes blazed. I told you about James. I told you how he destroyed my ability to trust. And you responded by perpetrating an even worse betrayal. At least James was honest about abandoning me. You made me care for you while lying about everything you were. You never meant to hurt me. Is that what you were going to say? She moved toward him now, fury animating every line of her body. You engineered this entire deception. You chose to spy on me, to test me, to make me trust a person who doesn't even exist. Thomas was kind. Thomas understood. Thomas saw me as more than a commodity. Her voice broke. But Thomas isn't real, is he? He was just another transaction. A performance designed to extract information. He was real, Elias said desperately. I was real with you. More real than I've been with anyone since Catherine died. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't you dare speak about truth when everything between us has been built on lies. You want to know what the worst part is? Not that you deceived me. Not even that you tested me like some prize mare you were considering purchasing. The worst part is that you made me hope. Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked. You made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I could trust again. That connection was possible, that I wasn't completely alone in my fear and grief, and it was all a lie. Every moment, every word, every confession, a lie. Lydia, please. The Duke arrives tomorrow, or rather, you arrive tomorrow, in your true form. We will proceed with the wedding as planned, because my family's survival depends on it. But make no mistake, Your Grace. She drew herself up, and he saw the walls slamming back into place, the vulnerability she'd shown him disappearing behind ice. You have destroyed any possibility of trust between us. You wanted a practical arrangement. You shall have one. I will be your Duchess. I will manage your household and bear your heirs, if God wills it. But you will never, ever have what Thomas briefly touched, my honest heart. That you've killed. She swept past him toward the door, and he reached for her arm. Lydia, wait. She wrenched away from his touch as though it burned. Do not presume to touch me. Do not speak to me again until our wedding day. And pray, Your Grace, that I can stand the sight of you long enough to speak my vows, because right now I would rather face debtor's prison than bind myself to a man capable of such calculated cruelty. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a cell door slamming shut. Elias stood alone in the library, the signet ring still clutched in his hand, and felt the full weight of what he'd destroyed. He had wanted to protect his heart. Instead, he had shattered hers, and his own along with it. The Duke of Thornwell arrived the following afternoon in a carriage bearing his full arms, attended by liveried servants and all the pomp his station demanded. Elias played his role perfectly. The distant nobleman come to inspect his future bride, cool and correct in every particular. The Marston family received him in the drawing-room with nervous deference. Lord Marston's relief at the Duke's presence palpable, despite his attempts at dignity. Lydia stood when he entered, her curtsy flawless, her expression a masterpiece of polite neutrality. She wore pale blue, and her hair was arranged with careful artistry. She looked every inch the aristocratic bride, beautiful and untouchable. Only he could see the careful blankness in her eyes, the way she held herself, as though made of glass that might shatter at an indelicate touch. "Lady Lydia." He bowed over her hand, his lips not quite touching her glove. "I hope I find you well." "Quite well, Your Grace. Thank you for inquiring." Her voice was pleasant, empty. They might have been strangers exchanging pleasantries at a garden party. The formalities dragged on interminably. Tea was served. Lord Marston outlined the wedding arrangements with excessive detail, clearly anxious to prove his family's worthiness despite their financial straits. Lady Marston made nervous conversation about the weather and the season. Clara Voss watched everything with barely concealed confusion, clearly sensing the strange tension, but unable to identify its source. Through it all, Lydia played her part with devastating competence. She smiled at appropriate moments. She answered his questions with courteous brevity. She was the perfect image of a dutiful bride accepting her fate with grace. She did not once meet his eyes. Finally, mercifully, Lord Marston suggested that the Duke and Lady Lydia might wish to speak privately, to become better acquainted before the wedding. The suggestion was transparent. He was offering them the illusion of courtship, a pretense that this was anything other than a financial transaction. But it served Elias's purposes. He needed to speak with her alone, needed to make her understand. They were left in the drawing room, the door decorously ajar for propriety's sake. The moment her parents' footsteps faded, Lydia moved to the window, putting as much distance between them as the room allowed. "Lydia, please." "Let me explain." "Explain what precisely?" She still didn't look at him. "Your methods? Your reasoning? The careful calculation that led you to spy on your future bride like some character from a Gothic novel?" "I needed to know if you were marrying me for my fortune." Now she did turn, and the look she gave him was colder than winter. "And what did you discover, Your Grace? Was I sufficiently mercenary to justify your deception? You know that's not what I found." "What you found," she said precisely, "was a woman trapped by circumstances, trying desperately to make the best of an impossible situation. What you found was someone who had already been betrayed by a man she trusted, still raw from that wound, and your response was to betray her again, more thoroughly, more cruelly than James Hartley ever managed. That's not, isn't it? At least Hartley had the decency to be honest about his mercenary nature. You dressed your suspicion and mistrust in servant's clothing and made me believe—" Her voice caught, and she steadied it with visible effort. "You made me believe Thomas cared, that someone saw me, truly saw me, and valued what they found. I did see you. I do value. You valued me enough to test whether I was worthy of you." The contempt in her voice was withering. "Do you know what the cruelest irony is? I was terrified of marrying you because everyone said you were cold, distant, severe, and you proved them right. You're exactly the man they described, calculating, mistrustful, incapable of honest connection. The only difference is that you're also a liar." They forgot to mention that part. The words struck home with devastating precision. "My methods were wrong. I admit that freely. But what we shared, what we spoke of, that was real, Lydia. My grief, my isolation, the connection we formed, none of that was false. It was all false, because it was built on a lie." She moved toward him now, anger giving her courage. "You cannot extract honesty through dishonesty and call it truth. You cannot forge connection through manipulation and claim it's genuine. Everything we shared is poisoned by your deception, rendered meaningless by the fact that you were performing an elaborate test I didn't know I was taking. I wasn't testing you, not after the first few days. I was—" "What?" "Falling for me." Her laugh was bitter. "How romantic. The Duke disguises himself to spy on his bride and discovers she's human after all. What a touching tale. Shall we tell it to our children some day?" Elias flinched. I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed your trust. But we're still to be married in 2 days. Surely we can find some way to… To what? Pretend this never happened? Build a marriage on the ruins of your betrayal? She shook her head. No, Your Grace. We shall be married because my family's survival demands it. My father's debts will not disappear because my heart is broken. My sister's futures still depend on this alliance. So yes, I will speak my vows. I will become your Duchess. I will perform every duty that role requires. Lydia, but make no mistake about what this marriage will be. Her voice was steady now, cold and clear as a bell. It will be precisely what I told Clara it would be. A contract, my bloodline for your fortune. A business arrangement, nothing more. You wanted to protect yourself from a mercenary bride? Congratulations, Your Grace. You've created one. I don't want that. I don't want a cold arrangement. Then you should have thought of that before you destroyed any possibility of warmth between us. She moved toward the door, her posture rigid. You spoke to me once about Marcus Aurelius, about finding freedom in the only place we have control, our own thoughts. Well, here is mine. You will have my presence, my name, my social graces, and if God wills it, my children. But you will never have what you briefly touched as Thomas. You will never have my trust, my honest heart, or my willing affection. Those you've killed. And unlike your grief for Catherine, they will not be resurrected. You're condemning us both to a lifetime of misery. No, Your Grace. You did that when you chose deception over honesty. I'm simply accepting the reality of what you've created. She paused at the door, her hand on the frame. The wedding is day after tomorrow. I suggest we both spend the intervening time preparing ourselves for a marriage that will be everything we each claim to want. Practical, convenient, and utterly devoid of genuine feeling. It should suit us both perfectly. She left him then, her exit as graceful as her earlier curtsy. Elias stood alone in the drawing room, surrounded by the faded elegance of a family selling its daughter to save itself, and felt the full weight of his catastrophic error. He had been so certain that protecting his heart was paramount. He had convinced himself that knowing her true character justified any method. But in his determination to avoid one kind of pain, he had created something far worse. A union that would bind them together in mutual isolation. Two people who might have found solace in each other condemned instead to a lifetime of careful distance. The irony was not lost on him. He had feared marrying a woman who saw him as nothing but a fortune. Instead, he would marry a woman who had briefly seen him as something more, and whom he had taught, through his own actions, to see him as something considerably less. He had wanted the truth, and the truth, it turned out, was unbearable. Thornwell Hall was vast, imposing, and utterly impersonal. Lydia moved through its corridors like a ghost, learning the rhythms of her new life with quiet efficiency. She was a perfect duchess, gracious to the servants, competent in her management of the household, flawlessly composed when receiving visitors. No one would have guessed that she and the Duke maintained separate bedchambers, that their conversations rarely extended beyond necessary coordination, that they were two strangers bound by law and living in careful isolation. Elias watched her from a distance, respecting the boundaries she'd erected while silently aching at the vast space between them. He had meant what he'd said in the conservatory. He would wait, however long it took. But waiting, he discovered, was its own particular torment. The silver key disappeared into Lydia's possession, and for weeks he had no idea if she'd used it. The library remained as he'd left it 5 years ago, books exactly where Catherine had placed them, her embroidery still draped over the chair arm, dust coating everything like a shroud. He'd given instructions that the room was to remain untouched, that only the Duchess had access. Then, 6 weeks into their marriage, he noticed a change. The dust on the reading table had been disturbed. A book had been moved, then carefully replaced. Someone had opened the curtains to let in light. Lydia had used the key. He said nothing. This wasn't about acknowledgement or gratitude. It was about her choosing, in her own time, to see the vulnerable place he'd offered. Whether it changed anything between them, he couldn't know, but at least she'd been curious enough to look. The weeks turned to months. They settled into a pattern of polite coexistence. They took meals together when duty required it, discussed estate business with professional courtesy, and presented a united front to society. To the outside world, they were the very picture of an appropriate aristocratic marriage. But in private, the distance remained. Lydia never mentioned the locked library. Elias never asked if she'd returned to it. They circled each other like wary dancers, neither willing to risk the vulnerability of honest conversation, yet small things shifted, almost imperceptibly. Lydia began joining him for breakfast more regularly, not out of obligation, but seemingly by choice. Once he found a book he'd been searching for left on his desk, a volume from the locked library that she must have retrieved. She never mentioned leaving it, but the gesture spoke volumes. He responded in kind. Fresh flowers began appearing in her chambers, not ostentatious arrangements, but simple sprigs of the same flowers she'd tended in the Marston Conservatory. He arranged for her sisters to visit, though it strained the household budget. He asked her opinion on estate matters and actually listened, implementing her suggestions. They were rebuilding. Slowly, painfully, without ever directly addressing what they were doing. It was progress measured in inches. Trust, reconstructed fragment by careful fragment. 4 months into their marriage, Elias discovered that several books from the locked library had been moved to Lydia's private sitting room, not hidden, displayed on her shelves as though she had every right to them, which he supposed she did. He'd given her the key. He'd given her access to everything. 5 months in, he returned from a business trip to find the locked library completely transformed. The dust was gone, the curtains cleaned, the furniture polished. Catherine's embroidery had been carefully preserved in a glass case on the mantel, treated with respect rather than removed. New books stood alongside the old ones. A woman's shawl, Lydia's, was draped over one of the chairs. She had claimed the space, not by erasing Catherine's memory, but by making room for herself alongside it. Elias stood in the doorway of the library, his throat tight, and understood what she was telling him without words. She was willing to honor his past while building their future. She was offering him the possibility of both grief and hope existing in the same space. It was the most generous gift she could have given. That night, he worked late in his study, reviewing contracts that blurred before his tired eyes. The house had settled into quiet, servants long since retired, when he heard the soft click of his study door opening. Lydia stood in the doorway, her hair loose over her shoulders, a dressing gown wrapped around her nightclothes. She looked younger like this, less armored, more like the woman who had spoken to Thomas in the conservatory about hope and heartbreak. "You're still awake," she said quietly. "Estate business. It never seems to end." He set down his pen, his heart suddenly racing. "Is something wrong?" "No. I was reading in the library, your library, and saw the light under your door." She moved into the room with careful steps, as though approaching something wild that might startle and flee. "I've been spending time there, in case you hadn't noticed." "I noticed. It's beautiful. The books Catherine loved, they're extraordinary. Her taste was impeccable." Yes, she had a gift for finding the profound in unexpected places. Lydia stopped beside his desk, close enough that he could smell lavender and something uniquely her. You loved her very much. I did. I'm not trying to replace her. I hope you understand that. I do. Elias looked up at her, seeing the carefully contained hope in her expression. Lydia, what you did with that room, honoring her memory while making it yours, it was more than I deserved. Perhaps, but it's what I needed to do. She reached out, her fingers hovering near his hand on the desk. These months, watching you respect my boundaries, give me space, offer kindness without demanding anything in return. I've been thinking about what you said in the conservatory. About Thomas being real, just wearing a different face. He was. He is. I think I'm beginning to believe that. Her fingers settled on his, light as butterfly wings. The Duke who gave me that key, who opened the most painful part of his life without conditions. He's not the cold, calculating man I thought I was marrying. And the servant who spoke to me about philosophy and grief. He wasn't a performance. He was you, without the armor of your title. Elias turned his hand over, carefully, giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. Her fingers threaded through his, tentative, but deliberate. I hurt you, he said. Nothing changes that. No. But you've spent months trying to make amends, showing me through actions, not words, that you understand what you destroyed and that you're committed to building something better. She moved closer, and he stood slowly, giving her control of the moment. Some foundations, even flawed ones, are worth rebuilding. Then she kissed him. Gentle, tentative, but unmistakably willing. Not the cold press of lips at their wedding, but something warm and alive and real. Elias stood very still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile peace she was offering. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. I'm not saying I've forgiven everything. I'm not saying there won't be days when I remember the betrayal and feel angry all over again. I understand. But I'm saying that I want to try, to build something honest between us. To see if we can create the marriage we both claim not to want, but I think we've both been longing for. Elias raised his free hand to her face, cupping her cheek with infinite gentleness. I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of that chance. I know. She smiled, small and genuine. You've already started. They stood together in the quiet study, two wounded souls who had found each other through deception and pain, now choosing deliberately to forge something true. It wouldn't be easy. The scars of betrayal would take years to fully heal. But they had time, and vulnerability, and the hard-won understanding that real connection required complete honesty. Elias pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. Thank you, he whispered, for using the key, for giving me another chance, for being braver than I deserve. We're both being brave, Lydia replied. That's what makes it worth doing. And there, in the lamplight of his study with estate ledgers forgotten, and the world reduced to the two of them, they began again. Not as Duke and Duchess, not as strangers bound by contract, but as Elias and Lydia, two people learning to trust after betrayal, to hope after heartbreak, to build a foundation strong enough to support not just duty, but genuine love. It was messy and imperfect and scarred by the wounds they'd inflicted on each other. And it was real. Finally, blessedly, devastatingly real. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.